Hello and welcome. It's Jennifer McGuire, and I hope all is well. So today I'm sharing with you lots of new techniques and ideas for using cardstock strips on your cards. This is an excellent way to use up those scraps that we've been hoarding, and I've done many videos in the past with ideas for cardstock strips, but today I have some new ones and also some other tips to share as we go through these card examples. I think this is a fun way to explore different color combinations, and also you could do this with your pattern paper scraps if you prefer. Normally I cut my own strips by using a trimmer, which I'll show you in a moment. However, today I'm using the Simon Says Stamp Strips 1 and 2 die sets. The reason I'm using these is it's a great way to quickly make cardstock strips that are all the same width. So if you want to make a certain pattern, sometimes this is helpful. So here I'm just cutting a bunch of strips at once so they're ready to go. You could always cut your own, as I mentioned, with a trimmer. What I like to do to get 3 exactly the same width is hold my cardstock pieces together and then cut them all together. So I'm cutting 3 at once here. And now I can be sure those are all the same width. Now, one thing I did want to demonstrate is when you put down strips that you cut yourself or strips that you cut with a die, the results are a little bit different. It's pretty subtle, but I'm one of those people who notices details, so I wanted to share it with those who are like me. So the first strips that I glued at the top of this white piece were cut with the die. These pieces I'm adding now, I cut with my trimmer. If you take a close look, there's a bit of a difference. The ones that are wider that I cut with the dies at the top kind of have a little shadow line in between because the dies create a rounded edge. Now the ones towards the bottom that are more narrow, that I cut with the trimmer, and you can see it's a little bit smoother between the strips. So it's just a personal preference. I do like the look of the strips that are cut with the die because I like that little bit of shadow between. It gives a really pretty finished look. Okay, let's get started with our first example where I show how to use your cardstock strips with an embossing folder. But I'm going to share with you one of my favorite tips, and I don't think I've shown it in a video in some time. I like to use graph paper when I'm creating. I'll link to the one that I like. Most graph papers have 4 squares per inch, which is really helpful if you're creating patterns or want to get things centered. I just cut my graph paper down to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, which is the size of the card I'll be creating. Now you can use copy paper or printer paper for this, which I've shown in videos many times. But I do find the lines on graph paper to be super helpful in making sure things are straight. So I have some of this on hand. I used to be an engineer, so I'm a nerd, so I really like graph paper, and I'll link to the ones that I like below. The particular one that I like is a little more expensive, but on one side there's 4 squares per inch, and on the other side there's 5 squares per inch. I like that option, but I will link to an inexpensive option also. If you don't have graph paper, totally fine. You can use copy paper or printer paper for this. The idea is to have something very lightweight that you can glue your strips onto. Now to find the center point of this graph paper, I could count the squares or measure, but I was lazy and I just decided to fold it in half so I would have that center line. Nobody's ever going to see this. Now I'm covering the front of the graph paper with adhesive. You could use a variety of adhesives, and I show other options later in this video. Here I'm just using a dot runner and covering as much of the front of it as I can. A glue stick would be a great option here too. Now I'm starting by putting my cardstock strip, the first one, right along that center fold line. Now I know that's centered and it's straight because of the fold and because the graph paper, I can look at those little grid lines and see it straight. If you don't have graph paper, you could just draw little pencil lines, use your grid on your work surface, whatever trick works for you, but I'm telling you, the graph paper makes it much faster. Notice when I bring in a cardstock strip, I kind of push it against the edge of the one that's already there and then lay it down into the adhesive. So watch, I push it right up against the edge and then lay it down. That really helps to make sure there's no gaps between them. It also helps to make sure that you continue to be straight as you add them. Because if you put one at a little bit of an angle, a tiny bit, it can cause your pattern to go off. Okay, so now I have put down my cardstock strips here. I did a variety of the different sizes. And I want the rest of that background to be white cardstock. There are many ways to do this, and I'm sharing with you the lazy way. So I just have a piece of white cardstock here. I laid it right into the glue on our grid background, and I'm cutting some of the excess off. Now I'll lay this into the glue on this side and cut the excess off. I could have measured and cut it so that it fit right when I put it down, but I thought this was much easier. So now I can use my trimmer to cut all the excess off. I'm actually going to cut the excess off and trim it down to be a little bit smaller, so the final background will be 4 by 5¼ inches. That way when I put it onto a note card, there'll be a little white trim around the edge. Now we can use this piece on anything we want. And because I use that thin graph paper, or you could use printer paper, it's not too thick to die cut or use an embossing folder or whatever. For this example, I'm using an embossing folder. This is new from Simon Says Stamp, and it's called Splendid Leaves Circle Frame Embossing Folder. I'm putting it into the embossing folder so that I get a raised pattern when I run this through my machine. I'm centering it in the embossing folder, then I'm using a little piece of tape to close it and hold it in place. Now for this particular embossing folder, I found that with my platinum, I just need the platform, 2 pieces of heavyweight cardstock, a metal adapter plate, and then the embossing folder. No clear plates needed. Every embossing folder is different, so you need to experiment or follow the instructions of the manufacturer to figure it out. But this works great with this particular embossing folder, which is beautiful. Look at that gorgeous, subtle result. I really like the detail of it. Okay, next let's do our sentiment strip, and I have 2 more of my favorite tips to share with you in creating that little sentiment. For this, I use the new Simon Says Stamp World of Love Sentiment Stamp Set. I really like the heartfelt messages in this, and we'll use them a few times in this video. My first favorite tip is for stamping a sentiment on a pre-cut strip. So this is a strip that I cut using one of the dies. What I suggest doing is creating a little bumper to help you stamp on it in your stamping tool. My bumper here is that white piece. I'm putting my cardstock strip right up against the top of the white piece and holding it there with my magnet. I lined up my stamp, and now we can do the stamping. I used my anti-static powder bag. I'm stamping with Versamark ink, and then I will add detail white embossing powder. Now the reason that little bumper that I added in there is helpful is I can stamp on multiple strips now because it's already positioned there. Also, sometimes it's hard to fuss with stamping on a cardstock strip since it's so narrow, so that bumper gives you a place to hold it. It's a simple little tip, but I found it's really helpful in stamping straight and centered on strips like this. Once I'm done, I just use my trimmer to cut the excess off each end. Now for the focal point of my card, I'm using an older Simon Says Stamp die called Heart of Roses. I thought it went nicely with the embossing folder that we used. Now I wasn't sure if I wanted to use the darker sentiment strip or the lighter, so that's why I made both options, and I can save the other for another card. I ended up going with the darker option since you can see I added it to a darker note card. I also decided to add vellum to the back of this white die cut. So I'm putting adhesive on the back here, and then I kind of dab it with my fingers so that there's no big blobs of glue, because I don't want that to ooze out and dry on the vellum because it might show up. Now while that dries, let's get our sentiment strip finished off. I've shown in many videos that I like to add additional layers to the back of the sentiment strip so it stands out. You can skip this if you want, but I had the remainder of that die cut strip, so I'm just using that to glue to the back. So I put one layer down, trim off the excess, and then I'll repeat that with another layer. Now this is a little detail that really it adds so little, but I like to do this sometimes when my sentiment strip is the focal point of the card. I like to use my paper sander to soften the sharp corners. I know these little details make very little difference, but this is like, I put a lot of thought into my cards and I put a lot of time, and it's things like this that make me happy. I don't know. So anyways, that is one tip if you want to look for a way to make your sentiment strip look even better. Okay, so now I can cut the excess of the vellum out from around the heart and we can assemble our card. So I added the heart and the sentiment strip onto the card, and now I'm adding a few Studio Katia Arctic Breeze pearls. These are iridescent white pearls, and I just thought it added a little bit of interest to that floral heart. Another thing you can do with cardstock strips is to decorate your envelope flap. If you do this, I just recommend you put a good amount of glue on the back so there are no edges that can get caught as it goes through the mail. I've done this many times and it's always worked out, so be sure to be generous with that adhesive. So you saw I put quite a bit towards the edges of the flap and all along the back of the strip. I'm using Gina K Connect liquid adhesive, which is super strong. So I'm just putting a few of these leftover strips on here, and now it will match our card nicely. And by the way, that sentiment on the envelope is from the same stamp set as the Missing You sentiment on the card. Okay, so here's a look at everything finished, and we have a card and a matching envelope using cardstock strips. Now check out the detail and texture that you get on the background using the embossing folder. It really adds a lot of interest to a background just made of cardstock. I'm also happy that more companies are doing embossing folders so we can do techniques like this. Okay, my next idea is to do a die cut inlay using cardstock strips, and the best part of this is it results in 2 cards from the one technique. And I have a tip for doing die cut inlay pretty quickly. Okay, this time I'm using Stick It double-sided adhesive for my strip technique. So this is a very thin double-sided adhesive, so it die cuts nicely. It also is forgiving. It doesn't hold on until you press it in place, so it gives you some time to be creative. I cut a piece that is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, and I have a piece of printer paper that's 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. In order to get those pieces lined up together, I use the corner of my Misty stamping tool. I put my printer paper down, then I peel off half of the release paper from the adhesive, and then line that up into the corner too. That really helps to get it lined up just right. I then use my bone folder to really press that adhesive onto the paper, and then we can start to remove the release paper. I didn't remove it all because I only need some of that adhesive exposed. I used my strip dies that I showed you earlier to cut a bunch from some scraps. I have this gold glitter scrap and then some oranges and yellows. I'm laying that right into the exposed adhesive. I'm not pressing very firmly because I can change my mind if I need to. Once you've got them positioned just right, we'll press them down and they will stay put. I like to fold the release paper back down, so watch, I'll fold it back down, and use a bone folder to press those pieces in. Remember, all of the white area still is covered with adhesive. Okay, so now we want to cover the rest of the background with white cardstock, and I'm doing the lazy way once again. I put a piece of white cardstock up against the exposed adhesive in this corner and just quickly trim off the excess so that I can remove the release paper from the top, add white cardstock to cover all of that, and then we will trim off the excess of everything. There are a million other ways that you could do this, but I want it to be a smooth piece. I could just glue the strips on top of white cardstock, but this way it's all smooth and it'll die cut much better. So now I can flip it over and use my trimmer to just cut off anything that's hanging off the printer paper piece we started with. For this card, I'm using the Simon Says Stamp Floral Card Front die. This is a great new background die. I use it to cut from the piece that we just created. So I tape it in place, run it through my die cut machine, and I try to leave all of the little pieces in the die by sliding it off the plates. You can see them all in the die there. So I'll set that aside. Now we need a piece of cardstock to assemble our pieces back on. So I have a piece of white cardstock here, and I'm covering it with the Stick It double-sided adhesive, using the corner of my Misty to help line it up. I then can remove the release paper. Now earlier off screen, I die cut with that floral card front die from white cardstock. So I have a white die cut here, and I'm laying it into that exposed adhesive on the white cardstock. And I use the release paper with my hand to press it down in place. There is some excess on the edge, and I'll cut that off later. Now it's time to do the die cut inlay. Here's my trick. I take the die with all the pieces in it, and I lay it over the die cut we just put on the exposed adhesive. It kind of pops in place. Once I feel it pop in place, I can push all of the pieces of the die cut into the adhesive behind it. So I use my fingers, and then for the smaller ones, I use a little tip of a bone folder or a craft pick. And I'm just pressing all of those die cuts out. So it pops out of the die and lands into the adhesive that's behind it. So I'll just continue to do this. And once I feel like they've all been pressed down, I can remove my die and check it out. All the pieces are inlaid. Sometimes a piece or two will stay behind, but you could do those by hand. It's much faster to do this for inlay than add each piece individually. And I have that leftover die cut that I can use on a second card. So let's use that leftover die cut now. I have another piece of white cardstock here that I covered with double-sided adhesive. I'll lay that leftover die cut right on top. So now all the openings have adhesive exposed. And I use the release paper to kind of press it down. Now I use the same background die and cut it from some ivory cardstock, leaving the pieces in the die. So now I can lay this on top of it and press the pieces down. One of the pieces fell out. I'll just add that later. So I line it up and then press all the pieces down. And then once they're all pressed into the adhesive behind it, I can remove the die, and we have our inlay complete. I do have a leftover ivory colored die cut that I could use on another card, but at this point, I think I'm going to stop. However, when I did this, I decided I wanted the frame to stand out. I wanted it to have dimension. So I wanted to show you I changed my mind. After I inlaid all those pieces, I decided to remove the frame. See how I'm able to do that because I used this Stick-It double-sided adhesive. Some of the inlaid pieces popped up, but that's okay. I can easily add those back later. So I die cut 2 more of the floral card front from white cardstock, and I'm gluing those 2 to the back of our fancy die cut, just to give it dimension. I left this in the video because I know people have mentioned that they like to see when I change my mind and how I make it work. And this is one thing you can do with that Stick-It adhesive. You can carefully remove it and then put it back how you want it. And that's one of the reasons I really like it. So now I can take my layered die cut and put it right back in its place. All we did was add 2 more die cuts behind it, put it right back in its place, and look how much more it stands out now. It really makes a big difference and was worth the time. And now I can go back in and pop in the other little inlay pieces that popped out. So, you can always change your mind as you create, especially if you use an adhesive that's pretty forgiving. Once I have everything in place, I will really press this down firmly with my fingers and a bone folder to make sure it sticks, and it'll stay put then. For a sentiment on these cards, I used the fun sentiment that says, "I sort of maybe love you a lot," from this new Simon Says Stamp Love Greetings Mix stamp set. Stamp that in black ink in the top corner. I also added my backgrounds onto a peach color note card that I created that is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. And I added more of those Studio Katia white pearls to the centers of the flowers. So you can see the beautiful inlay look we get here. I could have just glued the white die cut on top of the cardstock strip piece, but by die cutting the cardstock strip piece, we have the second card that we were able to create. So I hope this idea of using your cardstock strips for die cutting is helpful, and those tips for inlay. Okay, my next idea is to use your cardstock strips along with a stencil. And this I think is probably my favorite of the bunch because it's easy, can be used with any stencils, and it comes together pretty quickly. So I just have a variety of blue and green cardstock strips. This time I'm using Gina K Connect to glue each of these onto a piece of printer paper. So again, I'm using thin paper. You could use heavyweight cardstock for this one since we're not using an embossing folder or a die cut. But I kind of get in the habit of doing this, and that printer paper is really inexpensive. Okay, once I have those all down, I can trim the excess off, and then I'll cut down my strip to be 5 1/2 inches long so it goes across a card. For this card, I'm using the new Simon Says Stamp Boho Circle Stencil, which I am crazy about. I think it's beautiful and can be used in many ways. I'm on the back of the stencil, I'm taping our strip piece just to make sure that it's centered and straight. Over that, I'm applying Hero Art's Unicorn White Pigment Ink with a blending brush. I am really pressing into those open areas to get as much white ink as I can through those tiny little holes. The white ink on this colorful cardstock strip will be really beautiful, but you could also do Versamark ink and maybe a clear glitter embossing powder or any other color, maybe a dark ink too. Sky is the limit, but the white pigment ink looks really cool. So once I have generously applied all that ink, kind of twisting and turning in both directions, I can remove the stencil and check that out. I just think that's gorgeous. And then I will heat set it to make sure that that ink stays dry and I don't smear it and ruin it at this point. Next, I use the same stencil over a white note card, and I'm using another blending brush to apply Simon Says Stamp Fog ink. This is a very light gray warm ink, so you got to put down quite a bit of ink to get it to show up because it is a light ink. I love this ink. I use it quite often, and it's just a nice neutral to go with whatever colors you have. Okay, so now I can glue this piece right in the center and add a sentiment in the center, and we have a really impactful card. So that Love You is stamped in gray ink on a white die cut circle, and it's from the Love Greetings mix stamp set that I used on the last card. I also added more of the Studio Katia white pearls. I just thought it looked really nice added to that pattern. Doesn't take long to add those pearls, and it makes a big difference. You could also do little Nuvo drops or glitter drops if you prefer. So by using cardstock strips for this, it adds some interest. I could have used one solid colored band down the center, but doing the different blues and greens really makes it pop. Okay, my next idea is to use your cardstock strips to basically create pattern paper, and then use that pattern paper to create a scene on your card. For this, I'm finally getting to use the Simon Says Stamp Layered Hills die set that I've been excited about since it came out a few months ago. This was designed by my friend Laura Basson. Her daughter did this, her daughter Bailey. So talented and can be used in many, many different ways. Today, I'll be using it along with some cardstock strip pattern paper that I create. So these dies can be used to create hills and valleys and water and whatever you want. I decided to make it look like a Caribbean island scene with some ocean, some islands in the background, and a sunshine. So I die cut a bunch of blue, pool, and green cardstock strips, and I arranged them randomly onto a piece of copy paper. So, and this one I did 2 blues. I also did some with 2 greens, 2 pools, 2 yellows, and the sky I did 2 shades of sky blue. So I basically created my own pattern papers to use on this card. You could use solid cardstock, you could use pattern paper, but this was a fun way to use up some scraps and create a unique look. So I started to die cut from each of the pieces that I made. I have my little hill dies here to create the islands in the background. I used the wave dies to create the ocean. I used the sun die in the set from the yellow to create a sunshine. And the light blue stripe piece at the top will be the sky that will be in the background of the card. So I have a piece of white cardstock here that is 4 by 5 1/4, and I'm covering it pretty generously with adhesive. I'll start by putting towards the top the light blue stripe piece that I created, and I'll trim the excess off. So this will be the sky up on the top background. I then just started adding the different pieces. I used that adhesive that allows me to move things around a little bit, the dot runner, and that way I could kind of lay them in place and move them until I was happy with everything, and then I pressed it down firmly. Now this last piece I'm putting on the bottom, that's the color that I think of when I think of the Caribbean Ocean, but I felt like the contrast between it and the blue part of the ocean, the darker blue, was a little too high contrast. So I ended up replacing that bottom panel with darker teal cardstock, which you'll see in the end card here. Sometimes I make little changes like that after I pull it together. So here's the completed card. You can see I used the darker teals there on the bottom. I white heat embossed a sentiment from that same stamp set that I used earlier, the World of Love sentiments. I also added my sun and the little birds. So think about the different dies that you have, large open dies that you could die cut from your own pattern paper that you created with cardstock strips. It adds a little bit more interest than using a solid color. And I thought it really added some fun to the scene. Okay, next I thought I'd show you how I create these quilt-like squares using cardstock strips. I have some tips that make it really quick and easy to do. Great way to use up your scraps. So once again, I have a bunch of strips cut here, and I have a piece of copy paper, and I'm gluing each of the strips right up against each other. In this case, I decided to use Gina K Connect. That's really quick and easy and a great way to make sure the whole strip is glued down. But be sure to let it dry before you do any die cutting. It could turn into a mess if that adhesive isn't dry first. So that's a little tip there. Okay, so now after I've glued down some strips, you can see I went from green to purple and then purple to green. I decided to do a second card. And so I used wider strips from this one, and I just randomly glued them down. So I'll make 2 cards at once using the tip that I wanted to share. So I'm cutting off the excess of the scrap paper here. And now we're going to trim this down. Here's a trick into getting a square. I put the edge of my big piece against the trimmer blade in my trimmer, and I put a little mark here at the end. See that pencil mark? You could measure it, but why measure it and try to remember the number when you can do a pencil mark? Now I rotate it, line it up with the pencil mark and cut it, and I can be sure that is now cut into a perfect square. Super easy to do, and you can easily erase that pencil mark. After I've cut my squares, now I'm cutting from corner to corner in my trimmer. So now I have 2 triangles, which you could use as is, or you could put them back together and cut from corner to corner in the other way, and you end up with 4 squares. And we'll be able to rearrange these pieces in many ways to get different looks. And I'll do the same thing with the other piece. So now we have all of these triangles, and they can be assembled to create a square with a different look. They can be assembled to create kind of a diamond shape. You can interchange the pieces to get different patterns. Really fun to do this, and a great way to use up your strips and your scraps, but in a new look. Now for this one, I thought that yellow was too bright. Just showing you that I changed my mind a lot. I just ripped it off of there, and then I came in with this orangier color, put some adhesive on top of that yellow that I ripped off, and put this new one in place. So don't be afraid to change out stripes as you do this. Okay, so now we're going to trim this down and do my trick again to make a perfect square. Put it right up against the closed trimmer, make a pencil mark, rotate it, and cut it. And there we can be sure we have 2 nice squares. Okay, we'll do the same trick as before, where we cut from corner to corner to create our 2 triangles. Then we match them back up and cut from corner to corner to create 4 triangles. And I did that with the other piece too. So once again, we have more little triangles that we can patchwork back together in many different ways. Now I could assemble these onto a card as is, but I thought I'd step it up a bit and show you another way to change the look of your cardstock strips. I have a piece of printer paper here, and I'm just temporarily adhering each of the triangles into a square with a little gap in between each piece. And I'll do that with all 4 of my panels. Might as well create them all at once so we have 4 cards to make. So by temporarily adhering them here, we can do something fun to the top of them, and they'll all be spaced just right. So I have my 4 pieces here, I'll cut them apart, and now let's add some details. Okay, so I have my Spellbinders die cut machine. Any machine will work. And a Simon Says Stamp Detail Swirls die. This is one of those dies that creates a pierced pattern. I love dies like this. So now I'm laying one of the pieces that we assembled right onto it, and I'll run it through the die cut machine. And this won't cut anything. It'll just create those tiny little pierced pattern into our cardstock pieces. So watch this. You can take a look at it, and it just adds a fun pattern to it. A great way to step up the little pieces we made. So now let's do the same with one of our other squares. Run that through, and you can see the details added to it. Now on this next one, I use the Simon Says Stamp Detail Bohemian plate, which I've used before. It has a center pattern on it, so I cut my square down so I could be sure to line it up centered onto the plate. And we'll run that back and forth, and we'll end up with the fun pierce pattern on this too. So any of your piercing dies would be great for this, or you could use an embossing folder like we did at the beginning of the video. So now we can assemble our pieces onto our note card. Now here's the thing, I'm a little obsessed with those details as we've mentioned. I decided to add 2 layers of cardstock to the back of each of our triangles so we'd have dimension. You could use craft foam or foam tape if you prefer. These are actually white pieces of cardstock, some inexpensive white cardstock that I have that I can use to build these layers. I also like to use scraps of white cardstock where I stamp something and it didn't turn out, and nobody will ever see that. But I've run out of those pieces, so I'm just using inexpensive white cardstock. Now that I have layers behind each of these, I'm gluing them back together with a little white gap between them onto a piece of white cardstock. Now the reason I glued them temporarily onto a piece of copy paper to do the piercing thing was so that I could keep the pattern nice. The detail pattern would still line up when we assemble them back together onto a card like we're doing here. So I'll trim this down, and now we have this nice finished square to add to a card. And I did that with all the different pieces. Now on this one in particular, I decided to add a little interactive envelope to the front. This is the new Simon Says Stamp mini envelope die. It has a die to create the envelope, a die to create the folded note card that goes inside the envelope, and a little heart. So here I'm using my bone folder to fold along the score lines and then glue to assemble a little envelope. This is a super cute envelope, and the card fits inside. So this is a fun interactive card. I can write a little message on that card, tuck it in the envelope, and then that will be added to the front of the card for a fun hidden message. It'd be fun to do like a slimline card where you have a row of these little envelopes with different messages in each one. I also added the pink heart to the flap. Now I have a long sentiment strip from the Simon Says Stamp Love Greetings mixed stamp set that I showed you earlier. I stamped that with black ink on white cardstock, and I'm gluing it right onto the envelope. I will then add this piece onto a 4 1/4 by 4 1/4 white square note card. Now when I have a square card like that, I just put it in a regular envelope. It's 4 1/4 by 4 1/4, so it fits in my A2 envelope. You could also cut the envelope down, but you need extra postage when you have a square envelope. Okay, so let's look at the completed card. Here you can see that cute little envelope that you can pull the little note card from the inside. And check out all the detail that detail plate added, the piercing pattern, to our cardstock strip pieces. So it's hard to believe you kind of started with a simple cardstock strip background, and we just cut it up, reassembled it, and then added the pierced detail. Here's another one of the square cards that I created. This time I just added a white die cut heart and then the words "Love You" to the center. Kept it very simple, and you can stamp a sentiment on the inside. That "Love You" is from the coordinating die set for the Simon Says Stamp Heart Animal stamp set. Such a cute set. Those little sentiments are what I used on the inside of the card. Now the coordinating die set comes with those hearts and the "Love You" sentiment. And that's what I added to the center of the heart on my card. Now remember, I still have these other two squares. I glued them together, but I haven't finished making a card with them, but I have those ready to go too. It's nice when you can make multiple cards at once. And I have one last card that's super quick, and it uses up a leftover piece that I had unwanted on my desk. I had this cardstock strip square left over, and so I'm using the shadow die from the new Simon Says Stamp Love Your Guts sentiment die set. And I'm cutting the shadow from the striped piece. Then I die cut Love Your Guts from black cardstock and glued it on top. Now I'm using the new Mini Hearts Party die from Simon Says Stamp. It's that die at the top. It cuts a bunch of hearts at once in 3 different sizes, and they're great for adding onto your card as accents. So my friend Kathy Zilski is the one who designed this Love Your Guts, and I love that saying. I just think it's fun and playful, so this card's going to go to her. We're both also mega introverts, so this new Simon Says Stamp Introverts Unite stamp set is perfect for us. I stamped "I love that you get me" on the inside of the card, and on the envelope I put "I love that you text before calling," but I crossed out before and I put "instead of," because we always text. It's the way we are. But anyways, I like that set that you can make your cards fun and playful. So here's a look at the completed card. I did use the detail plate on the back of the card, so it's got those pierced swirls in it. And I layered up my black die cuts 3 thick, so there's some fun dimension. This Love Your Guts is just a fun and playful way to say love you, and I actually need to make a few of these for a few friends. All right, there you have a bunch of different ways to use cardstock strips on your cards. I hope this inspires you and helps you to think outside the box when using them up. If you want to check out the supplies I use, they're linked below in the YouTube description, but my blog has a lot more information, and that's linked here on the top right. In the middle are a couple other cardstock strip videos that you might enjoy too. Thank you for spending this time with me. I hope you're all staying healthy and happy, and we'll see you soon.